The New Babylon, Chapter 16. As the footsteps drew closer, Kevin pulled his wife back behind him and behind the concrete pillar. He stood with his back to the pillar as well, listening as the shadow approached. He drew his Glock 19 and held it in his right hand. He knew a shot would bring unwanted attention, and at this hour, so far from home, that is the last thing he wanted. When the footsteps were at their position, Kevin stepped sideways from behind the pillar. Still holding the Glock, he reeled back, catching the intruder's face with a well-placed strike with his elbow. The intruder stumbled backwards, managing to catch himself before he fell to the ground. He sprung forward, deflecting Kevin's right arm as he attempted to level the Glock on the intruder. The intruder stumbled backwards, managing to catch himself before he fell to the ground. He sprung forward, deflecting Kevin's right arm as he attempted to level the Glock on the intruder. With Kevin's right hand pointing in the air, the intruder struck him twice, in the face and in the chest. The second blow knocked the wind out of him, and Kevin fell back against the concrete pillar. As he prepared to block the next blow by his assailant, the moonlight caught the intruder's face. "Jay?" Kevin exclaimed. Jason stopped in his tracks and answered, "Kevin, is that you?" Kevin let out a sigh of relief and quickly looked around to see if the scuffle had drawn any unwanted attention. "Are you okay? Where's Sarah?" Kevin responded as Sarah came out from behind the pillar. "We're okay, Jay. Let's move out. I'll fill you in when we put some distance between us and here." Looking around again, he said, "Let's double time back to the way you came. Did you see any activity on your way here?" "Nothing unusual, Chief," Jay replied, as the three of them moved quickly back toward home. Randy sat on the shoulder of Interstate 81 South. He listened to static on the patrol car's radio. Randy has never been a member of any law enforcement agency. He stole the patrol car after he and his team ambushed two troopers on the road a few miles from here a couple weeks back. Randy was smart, and he never really had a propensity for honest work before the collapse. Now, in this post-event environment we found ourselves thrust into, that combination of traits was proving to be deadly. The two members of Randy's team were both dead after they attempted to take Arby's cabin last night, an operation that Randy did not sanction. In fact, Randy had warned them that if they went out on their own and were unable to make the designated checkpoint at 9 this morning, that they might as well stay out there on their own. Now it was 9:30. Randy believed that that is what happened. He believed they had gone off on their own. He didn't consider their departure much of a loss for his group. In fact, he saw them as more of a liability than anything. If not for the fact that his wife was a sister to one of them, he never would have allowed them in the first place. When Will and the kids crested a knoll in the road, they saw Randy's patrol car sitting off on the shoulder. They were walking in the median between the north and southbound lanes. The median was below the grade of the road, and they saw Randy's car before they appeared in view of it. Will pulled out a small pair of binoculars he had in the inside pocket of his tactical vest, and from a position of concealment, he observed Randy. He could see that there was only one person in the patrol car. He could see that he was not wearing a uniform or anything else designating him as a legitimate member of LE. Will knew that that alone did not mean much, but his instincts were telling him something was majorly wrong. In this post-collapse society, it didn't make any sense that law enforcement would be set up on the interstate. Vehicular traffic was limited at best. Gas was a hard commodity to source, and those that did have it typically were obtaining it through nefarious means. Any law enforcement agency that still had fuel wasn't wasting it running cars out to sit on the highways, where there was hardly any traffic to begin with. They were using their fuel resources mostly for generators and vehicle assault teams to respond to higher level emergencies. Still, though, every agency was operating autonomously, and who could say what judgment, or lack thereof, was running this department? After considering it every way he could think of, Will came to the obvious conclusion: don't make contact. He decided to move himself and his kids covertly back down the way they came. Once back below the crest of the road behind them, they crossed over and plotted a course up through the woods and around the cruiser. Not knowing if Randy was working alone or if he had another team member positioned nearby, Will cut a large path, widening the perimeter away from Randy to give ample distance to anyone who might be working with him. The turnoff to the secondary highway heading toward the town where Arby's cabin was located was only a few miles down the interstate. Will made the distance to Arby's at about 30 to 40 miles away, close enough to allow himself the indulgence of believing they could make it, but far enough away still to prudently harness his anticipation. Now, with this forced detour, he knew they just added at least another almost full day of hiking. They were tired and hungry and physically distressed. They were feeling defeated mentally, emotionally, and physically. The kids were troopers. They had held up better than anyone could have anticipated. Will was proud of them. But Will, too, felt the distress creeping in. He knew he had to get them to Arby's, and quickly. He also knew that if he didn't keep his head clear and follow the protocols he had set up for them in the planning stages, that this was the time when a simple mistake made from haste or desperation to get where they were going could prove to be catastrophic. It truly was life or death. This was an extremely crucial time. Will and the kids walked up into the woods. They found a place suitable to camp for the night. They were wet and cold, but Will insisted that they not build a fire. They huddled together for warmth under a couple of blankets that they had. Lindsay said, "Dad, can we pray together? The Bible says that we have not because we ask not. I think we should ask God for help." Will looked at his daughter and smiled. "That's a good idea, honey. Why don't you lead us?" Lindsay smiled back and opened her heart to God. She asked him for his mercy, his grace, and his love. She asked him to watch over and protect them. She asked him to get them safely to where they were going. She asked him to sustain them during this difficult time. She asked, above all else, that they accept and embrace God's will for their lives, whatever course it took. Then, Lindsay took out a small baggie of wild edibles she had foraged along the way. She gave thanks for it and shared it with her dad and brother. Tired, cold, and wet, with a little bit of food in their bellies, the kids drifted off to sleep. Will remained awake and alert. He would wake Will Jr. in a few hours to keep watch as he himself would get some sleep. He looked up at the sky. The moon was less than half full. It gave enough light to see a little, and at the same time allow them to stay hidden in the darkness. Will thought of all that they had come through. He thought of all that lay ahead of them. He traced out the constellations in the distant sky. He imagined the scene at Arby's cabin. A warm fire, food to eat, a place to hang their wet clothes to dry. And then he stopped himself. He could not allow himself to be there in that place of comfort. He knew that he had to stay focused on the journey instead of the destination. They were close, and yet, at the same time, far away. Will prayed his own prayer to God. He prayed for his kids, for their safety, and their reunion with the team, the people who loved them and would welcome them as family. Will looked at his kids as they slept. He knew in his heart that they were what mattered most. He told God what they meant to him. He knew that God already knew that, but he told him just the same. For the last few days, Will had an uneasy feeling, a feeling of impending doom. No matter what he did, he could not shake that feeling. Now, as he prayed to God, as he pleaded with God to watch out for his kids above all else, a feeling of peace and comfort enveloped him. He knew in his heart that everything would be okay for them, that no matter what happened, he knew that God would protect and watch over his kids. He knew that that feeling of peace was God's answer to his prayer. He thanked God for it. Will looked down at his watch. He rubbed his eyes and thought, 3 more hours and I can get some sleep. Bryce and his wife sat smoking on the porch at Arby's cabin. They sat in silence, staring out at the cold, dark night. Neither said anything, but both knew what the other was thinking. Bear wanted desperately to try to make radio contact with Will and the kids. She knew that Bryce would not allow that. She also knew that his adherence to every protocol was prudent, that it was necessary. Still, she had that feeling that the situation for Will and the kids was growing more desperate every day that they didn't hear from them. Bart estimated many different scenarios and the corresponding timeline associated with Will's arrival for each one. The outside estimate came and went nearly 2 weeks ago. The mood at the cabin was a somber one. The team members knew they could do nothing but wait patiently. Their wives and girlfriends were not so patient. Tensions were escalating. Bear knew better than to let the desperation get to her. She knew better than to let it show. She knew it would not serve any constructive purpose, and that Bryce and the rest of the team did not need the added pressure. Bryce could tell she was feeling that desperation by the silence she wore. It was not in her nature to be silent, to be somber. Usually, she answered stress with jokes and witty banter. Bryce knew from her demeanor that she was scared and desperately worried for Will and the kids. They just sat together in silence and smoked. Bart stepped outside holding a thermos full of hot coffee. He poured some in to top off the cups that both Bryce and Bear held. He poured himself a fresh cup as well. He looked at Bryce and at Bear. He looked back at Bryce and said, "I think it's time we consider our next move." Bryce slowly nodded and answered, "What are you thinking, LT?" Bart let out a heavy sigh. "Well, they're 2 weeks overdue, minimum. That's best case. I know protocol dictates we wait, but we need to do something at this point." "I agree," Bear blurted out. "We need to go look for them." Bart looked down and then up at Bryce. They were thinking the same thought. Bryce said it first. Or move on without them. Bart looked down again and nodded. Bear jumped to her feet. "You're kidding, right? Please tell me you aren't considering going on without them. That's unacceptable." Bryce cut her off. "Honey, protocol is, after a reasonable time, we continue on. If Will and the kids make it here after we're gone, we'll leave enough stuff hidden here for them to resupply. Looking for them is useless. There are a dozen different routes they could have taken, and we can't begin to know where to search. And they do know where we're headed." Bear yelled at her husband, "The heck with Will's protocols. This is ridiculous. Let's see if we can reach them on the radio. At least try before we abandon them. Darn it, Bryce. She pounded on his chest with her closed fist. Bryce just absorbed it and pulled her in close to him. She started to cry. He said nothing as he held her. He looked over her shoulder at Bart, who was standing behind her. Bart just looked back at him and said nothing as well. He turned and sipped his coffee as he stared out at the night sky. He saw the Big Dipper, the same constellations that Will was staring at. Both men were huge astronomy buffs. Bart knew if Will was out there, that he too would be staring into the night sky. "Where are you, buddy?" Bart muttered. Bart turned back toward Bryce and Bear. "Get a good night's sleep. We'll assemble to discuss the matter tomorrow at 0800 right after breakfast." Bart stepped off the porch and walked up the gravel road, still staring up into the sky.